Well, very warm welcome from me as well. My name is Dharmasara. I'm part of the team here at the Saturday class. Very warm welcome to you if this is your first time here at the center. So in the second half now, we usually have a talk or some form of input, or it's usually a talk. So today I will talk a little bit about Parinirvana. Just like no one knows what that means, so it's a great title for a talk. He knows. Yeah, great. Lalitratna knows. It's a Buddhist inside joke, sorry. Yeah. Anyata Lalitratna, yeah. Again, sorry, inside jokes here. So Parinirvana, well, to put it very, very simply, it basically means, well, to put it in very plain terms, the death of the Buddha. Yeah, so this is the Buddha's death day. So next weekend on Sunday, we will celebrate Parinirvana Day. Yeah, Parinirvana Day. So we commemorate the death of the Buddha. Yeah, so in this Buddhist center, we've got all sorts of different festival days happening, and they tend to, celebrate different events in the life story of the Buddha. We've got the Enlightenment of the Buddha. We've got the day that celebrates the first time he was teaching to people, and there's the day where the Sangha was forming. So one of them is obviously also the death of the Buddha. The Buddha being born a human being. He had to die one day as well. But with the Buddha, it's a bit interesting, yeah, because the whole point of a Buddha is that he's not like us, yeah, that he's not like a normal human being. So you could say his body died, but whatever happened to his consciousness, well, we don't know. We can only know once we're enlightened, yeah. So sometimes we try to avoid this terminology of the death of the Buddha because it's a bit spooky. Yeah, it's a bit mysterious what actually happened there. The word parinirvana, has the word nirvana in there. So like enlightenment, like awakening, and pari sort of means something like can either mean something like ultimate enlightenment, the ultimate awakening, or it can mean something like without remainder. Yeah, so he was fully enlightened without remainder. I don't really want to go too much into the details of that. That's just for you if you're really into Buddhist philosophy, for the few nerds and geeks among you, like myself. That just basically you could say that, enlightenment being that ultimate transformation of mind, that ultimate transformation of consciousness. His physical body was still sort of part of the world. So with his sort of the death of his physical body, he finally fully gained ultimate enlightenment, you could say. Again, this is all theory. This is all just sort of dictionary definitions. It's quite mysterious. Who knows what that actually means? Yeah, we'll only know once we're there ourselves. So that's the talk. Thank you very much. I don't have anything more to say about that. We can all go home now and eat cake. But in a way, the only thing, what I want to talk about today is actually sort of what happened before that. What I would like to do today is just share a few stories of the Buddha's life, just shortly previous to his final passing, yeah, his death. The death of his body, because there's a very long text, a very long teaching in the scriptures, the Pali Canon, called the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. So it's sort of the greater story of the last days of the Buddha, and I think it's the longest chapter, the longest teaching in the Pali Canon. It's like the longest text we have. So that shows you how important it was to people. They kept sort of adding stories, and they kept kind of really remembering what happened there. So it's a lovely text. Yeah, it's a lovely text. So if you wanna have a really good foundational reading of Buddhism, you could just be reading that, because it's got everything in there. It's got Buddhist teachings in there. It's got lovely, funny stories in there, lovely humor, solemn passages, all sorts of different things. So it's quite long. So I hope I can not make this too long, but I kind of chose sort of 2 to 3 stories which really, they highlight what those last days must have been like, and they also highlight what Buddhism is about. And they really highlight Buddhism. Some of those stories really highlight what Buddhist teaching is essentially about, and some of those stories, they don't necessarily contain much teaching, but they give you like a really lovely flavor of the spirit, of how the communication was, how the people lived together, what being a Buddhist at the time must have meant. So that's why I've chosen them. So that's 2 or 3 stories. Let's see how we go. Well, we've already heard a few of those stories, so I'm not going to go into them too much. We've heard a few stories a few weeks ago when Sangadarshini was talking about Tara Chitta, who's an order member in our movement, who died recently, and she was kind of also then sharing a few stories from that sutta, from the last days of the Buddha. So we heard those legends of when the Buddha was about to die, when he was lying down on his final deathbed, he was lying beneath twin Sala trees. These are Indian trees, apparently, that you have in India. I've never seen one, unfortunately. They're supposed to be quite beautiful. And in the stories it said, so this is what Sangadarshini told us, in the story it said that even though those trees, even though they weren't in season, they started blooming and flowers were falling down on the Buddha and raining down on the Buddha. And then the Buddha said, and there's all sorts of deities who've come and, we're revering the Buddha. So now whether or not you take that literally is up to you. So maybe that did happen. Maybe that is just really evocative of the kind of atmosphere that was around, among the people. So, his disciples were gathered, his, the monks, the nuns, the lay people, even people who weren't Buddhists, who were just around in the town at the time, they came. So there must have been that atmosphere of, the Buddha being 80 years old at the time, an old man, spent his life teaching people, his life wandering around in the jungles from town to town, teaching, giving his life to helping people develop, helping people transform their consciousness. So it must have been that sort of solemn but joyful, graceful atmosphere, I imagine. So it must have been as though, there was this sort of rain of blessings, this rain of flower petals raining down. But maybe it did happen. Maybe it happened literally like that. Who knows what happens when a Buddha dies? It's up to you. You can choose. And she's also shared the story of shortly before that, when the Buddha started to get quite ill, and because he actually died of food poisoning. He unfortunately ate a meal that had gone off, which was offered to him. He wasn't poisoned in that way. It was an accident, basically. But him being 80, obviously his body wasn't, up to that anymore. We also heard this lovely story of the Buddha lying down, already in pain, and Ananda, his attendant for 20 years, who also happened to be his cousin. So for the last 20 years, Ananda was his attendant. He, walked wherever the Buddha walked. He would listen to whatever the Buddha said, and he would memorize whatever the Buddha was teaching. So it was Ananda's job to listen to what the Buddha said, so that he could memorize it and repeat it to others. And in that, there's this lovely story where the Buddha is quite ill, and Ananda sort of has a moment of grief. Ananda isn't enlightened yet, so he's still sad. And the Buddha tells him off and said, and sort of says, well, I told you everything's impermanent. I told you attachment leads to suffering, so, don't cry for me. Argentina. No, sorry. I'm having a musical phase at the moment. Stop that. So there's this lovely moment where Ananda is just sort of leaning against the doorpost and is really weeping, and it's just really sad that the Buddha is quite sick and clearly is going to die, or it's not going to live for much longer. And the only thing sort of Ananda can say, how sad it is that the Buddha is dying, and he calls the Buddha "he who was so kind." Yeah, he who was so kind. This is what Ananda has to say about the Buddha. In the talk about the Parinirvana Day, Sangrakshta, the founder of our order, he really points out, isn't that interesting that Ananda has been with the Buddha for 20 years, listening to every teaching, and some of those teachings can be quite, sort of metaphysical, or can be quite sort of, philosophically astute and, quite sort of mind-blowing. The only thing that springs to mind for Ananda is the Buddha's kindness. Yeah, the Buddha's kindness with which he communicated those teachings. The kindness that the Buddha had towards people, even when he was communicating profound truths to him. Yeah. So anyway, those two stories we've heard from Sangadarshini a while ago, where we can already see that sort of atmosphere, the atmosphere that must have lingered for the last few days of the Buddha's life. So we know that the Buddha must have been a very kind man, very kind person. And we've heard the whole, that sort of almost legendary supernatural phenomenon of those, of the untimely flowers raining down on him from the trees. Okay, but now to my stories. So I've picked, three really. I won't go into them too much, and we'll focus a bit more on the third one. The first one is actually happens quite a long time before the Buddha actually gets sick. Yeah, so he's already an old man, but there's sort of no signs yet of his disease, and it's actually the very beginning of the sutta. So this is how the sutta starts, and I wasn't actually going to talk about this one when I prepared the talk, but I saw this and I thought, oh, this is actually really good. I really like this particular teaching because it's very fitting to our times, I think. So what happened is, all these suttas, these teachings, they always start with telling us where the Buddha lived at the time, where he was staying. And at this time, the Buddha is staying at Rajagaha, which is called the Vulture's Peak Mountain, which you can actually go there. You can visit that place. It's not too far from Bodh Gaya, from where the Buddha gained enlightenment. There's actually a place called Rajagaha. What's it called these days? It's can't remember. It has a slightly different name these days. Small town. I went there last year. It was very beautiful. You can go up the mountain, that Vulture's Peak, where the Buddha is supposed to have stayed and taught quite a few suttas, and where he's supposed to have stayed in caves as well to meditate. It's this lovely, peaceful atmosphere there. It's not very high. It's not a very tall mountain at all, but it's a sort of singular peak in a bit of a valley. Yeah, it's really lovely. It's also weirdly not very crowded. Yeah, there's loads of tourists at the bottom of the mountain because they all go up to this like Japanese pagoda that the Japanese have built up there, which is a bit. I mean, I'm really into Japan, but that one was a miss. It's actually not very beautiful. Sorry if anyone's been part of that, but so it's lovely. It's just a lovely space. So he was staying there, and then he's getting visited by a Brahmin called Vasakara. Yeah, Vasakara. He's a Brahmin, which means that he was a sort of religious priest, a minister, high caste, and he was sent by a king. Yeah, so Vasakara was sent by the king Ajatasattu. Yeah, Ajatasattu. He was a king of a local kingdom called Magadha, which was one of the main kingdoms, which kept expanding. Then they kept wanting to grow their influence. And King Ajatasattu thought to himself that he wants to invade. He wants to invade the Vajjis. Yeah, so the Vajjis are a clan next to Magadha, and he thinks to himself, I shall wipe out these Vajjis, so mighty and powerful, I shall destroy them, and lay ruin and devastation upon them. And he thinks to himself, well, he's not quite sure if it'll work, so he sends the Brahmin Vasakara to the Buddha, to ask him, will he be successful? I think the king hasn't quite understood what a Buddha is. He sort of thinks he's some sort of oracle or something, but he knows that sort of enlightened ones, spiritual people, they never lie. Yeah, so he says to Vasakara, remember well how the Buddha answers and tell it to me, for realized ones say nothing that is not so. Yeah, so he knows that he'll get the truth, whatever it might be. Okay, so then Vasakara gets to the Buddha and asks him the question. Magadha wants to invade the Vajjis, and will that be successful? Is that a good idea? The Buddha is like the first thing we learn about Buddhism is that the first precept is about not killing and not harming others. So I don't know what they expected in asking the Buddha. Well, they didn't have social media, so I guess they didn't know what Buddhism was at the time. It's quite interesting the way the Buddha then answers. So the Buddha is sitting there. Ananda, who we've heard about before, is standing behind him, fanning him actually, giving him some nice air. So the Buddha doesn't reply directly. He doesn't give the truth directly to Vasakara, but he's talking to Ananda behind him. So he says to Ananda, Ananda, have you heard that the Vajjis meet frequently and have many meetings? Ananda replied, I have heard that, sir. As long as the Vajjis meet frequently and have many meetings, they can expect growth, not decline. Ananda, have you heard that the Vajjis meet in harmony, live in harmony, and carry on their business in harmony? I have heard that, sir. As long as the Vajjis meet in harmony, live in harmony, and carry on their business in harmony, they can expect growth and not decline. Ananda, have you heard that the Vajjis don't make new decrees or abolish existing decrees, but proceed having undertaken the ancient Vajjan traditions as they have been decreed? I have heard that, sir. As long as the Vajjis don't make new decrees or abolish existing decrees, but proceed having undertaken the ancient Vajjan traditions as they have been decreed, they can expect growth, not decline. Ananda, have you heard that the Vajjis honor, respect, esteem, and venerate Vajjan elders and think them worth listening to? I have heard that, sir. As long as the Vajjis honor, respect, esteem, and venerate Vajjan elders and think them worth listening to, they can expect growth, not decline. And so on. He goes into a few more of those, but I just wanted to give you these. So it's quite interesting, isn't it? Especially I find the first one to be particularly interesting. He says, as long as the Vajjis meet frequently and have many meetings, they can expect growth, not decline. So you can see he's sort of saying, well, the Vajjiyans, they have a functioning society basically. Yeah, they have a functioning society, meaning they meet regularly and they actually meet each other. They try to carry out their business in harmony, and they don't there's no doubt around how society works around them. Yeah, it's a unified society. They know this is what's meant with the decrees. They don't abolish existing decrees. I don't think the Buddha, well, that's my interpretation. I don't think the Buddha means, they just sort of blindly follow whatever old tradition they have. But it's about, well, what works? Let's keep what works, and let's not get bored with, things that work. Sometimes we do have this habit, don't we? We sort of invent new ways of doing, just because we got a bit bored with the old ways, when actually there are things that still work that we can keep with. And they honor and respect the elders and think them worth listening to. So the Vajjian, they think that people who've lived a long life have something to say. We can listen to them. We respect them and care for them. Yes. So he just finishes saying. Then the Buddha said to Vasakkara, Brahmin, this one time I was staying near Vesali at the Sarandada shrine. There I taught the Vajjis these 7 principles that prevent decline. As long as these 7 principles that prevent decline last among the Vajjis, and as long as the Vajjis are seen following them, they can expect growth, not decline. When the Buddha had spoken, Vasakkara said to him, Worthy Gotama, if the Vajjis follow even a single one of these principles, they can expect growth, not decline. How much more so all 7? King Ajatasattu cannot defeat the Vajjis in war unless by bribery or by sowing dissension. Well now, worthy Gotama, I must go. I have many duties and much to do. And then the Buddha just says, please, Brahman, go at your convenience. Which I think he has I don't know, I find it quite ironic. So isn't that interesting? So there's actually a commentary tradition of this sutta, which then says that King Ajatasattu heard that, and then he actually did start to undermine the Vajjis by sowing dissent and getting them not to follow those 7 principles, and then he conquered them. And then afterwards, the Buddha immediately calls together his order, the monks and nuns. I think in this case it's the monks, but obviously it applies to the nuns as well. And then applies those 7 principles to the spiritual community as well. Yeah. So the first one being meeting regularly and in large numbers. This is one of those principles which, prevents decline, and we can expect growth. And I think this is something that I've been thinking about quite a lot recently. Also in terms of just sort of our state of the world in general. It's I think we are living in a world where we think we are more connected than ever, when actually we're more isolated than ever. Yeah, it's my opinion. With sort of, it's very easy to stay at home the whole day. And be in communication with all sorts of people, get information from all sorts of sides, get all sorts of input, without ever having seen a single person, flesh to flesh, yeah, without ever having seen a human being, yeah. Some people can, with home office and all that, we can sort of be in isolation for weeks on end if we wanted to be. And yet we have this illusion of being in connection, of being in contact with people. So isn't that interesting that the first thing the Buddha says is, well, we actually ought to meet. We actually ought to come together, and not just one-on-one, but actually in a sort of bigger, just sort of as people together, yeah? Like us here on a Saturday. That's why I really like those Saturdays, because, where in what context do we actually meet in a large number like that with other people, without, and I'll actually talk to each other. I guess we could go to the cinema or the concert or whatever, but, there isn't much sort of, it would be lovely if there was, but there isn't much sort of communication happening. So communication, actual, real human connection is important, because what happens if you meet regularly and in large numbers with your community, it's very difficult to sustain stories about other people. It's very easy to have a story or a box you put people in if you're just sort of scrolling through social media. But if you keep coming into a room with people, it's very difficult to actually sustain a fixed image about someone. Eventually, we will have to drop that image. We will have to drop that story. We will have to start seeing, because we will start seeing people in all their different shades and particularities, and very, very difficult to just see them as one thing. This is one of the reasons why, sort of in our community, people, some people decide to live together, some people decide to work together, because that actual human connection in all parts of life is just really important for letting go of that kind of wrong perception of people. Yeah, it is actually conducive in the long term, maybe not immediately, to metta and friendliness. well, if you start living with people, initially you think your metta has gone out of the window, and you actually start hating people, and you realize, oh, there's actually a lot of hate there. But that's good, yeah, that's a good thing. Because if you just all, decided to isolate ourselves and be alone, well, we would only have lukewarm emotions, yeah, we wouldn't be able to actually know what we're working with. So to have something that, to have actually other people in the way is really helpful to, well, get in touch with our emotions first so that we can then refine them and turn them into love. Yeah, I noticed that I've been living in community now for, I think, 8 years now, in different communities, with Buddhist communities, with other people, varying different constellations. I'm working for the Buddhist Center now for like 5 years or something like that. Don't know. Feels longer. We work together in teams. There's a lot of sort of teamwork here. These classes are led in teams. Our management team. We have a team. We sort of try to have everything on a team basis. And I can tell you, this has been one of the most challenging times of my life. Yeah, most transformative time of my life, because before that, when I had a job, I would usually just work, in a sort of small office, and I would just sort of scan stuff or whatever. But very difficult to get your emotions flowing. Yeah, very difficult to get your, not even talking about hatred, just any sort of emotion flowing. Very difficult. But be in a team with people where you're trying to get something to work, you have to transform. Yeah, otherwise you'll explode. That's how I felt. So I think this is the point of the Buddha. He is trying to say, well, if we want to, so he's making a commentary about society, but also about spiritual communities. If we want to not decline but grow, we'll have to start to meet. Yeah, we will have to actually meet up. We'll have to be together. It doesn't matter if we are not feeling like it. Doesn't matter whether we have strong reactions and all that. And ideally, then the second thing is meeting in harmony, leaving in harmony, carrying their business in harmony. Well, that's a tall order. That's quite a tall ask, but that should be the ideal. Yeah. And if we can't do that, if we can't meet in harmony, if we can't actually be with one another in harmony, well, then it's up to us again. Yeah. Practicing metta, practicing friendliness, trying to establish something of harmony, or actually working towards harmony. Harmony is can be a bit of a red herring, is that the word? Can be a bit of a sort of funky word that's thrown around. Harmony doesn't mean that on the surface level everything's fine and you sort of push everything under a rug. That's not harmony. Harmony means, I think in my experience, it comes about when you learn to relax around other people. Yeah, when you learn to just be with others, no matter what's there. Yeah, no matter what's happening with them. And when you're courageous enough to, well, if you say things to others, and if you take responsibility for your own actions. Yeah, my problem is usually being a bit too outspoken. I usually sort of have to catch my words again. But what I've learned is that harmony comes, not by not saying those things, but by then actually taking responsibility for your own actions. Responsibility being one of those big things in Buddhism. Okay, so that's the first story. I've talked a bit more about that than I wanted, so I'll keep the other two a bit shorter. Now the second story is actually my favorite. It's really short, and it's not really a story at all, but it's just, I don't know, it's almost just one little paragraph, but I find it really sweet. So this is a bit later, so the Buddha is, actually don't know where he is. He's traveling around in Vesali, wherever that is, somewhere in India. And he, by the time that the Buddha was 80, he was obviously, he had been teaching for most of his life. So he gained enlightenment, according to tradition, around the age of 35. Some traditions say 25, but the mainstream tradition says 35. And so by the time that he's 80, he's already fairly well known, yeah? And religious people at the time in India were sort of in, yeah? So the Buddha wasn't the only religious person at the time. There was all sorts of other teachers around, and people were, even if they weren't Buddhists, they were quite fond of religious teachers because they gave instructions, they gave things to ponder about, they gave interesting advice. So this is about Ambapali, the courtesan. She's a courtesan. Courtesan. English is a difficult language. Because then, I don't know, it's like with pronunciation. I'd sometimes ask my friends and, try to get the pronunciation right, but then an Australian person comes along, it's like, no, that's not how we say it. Make up your own. Had that happen to me a few times. So Ambapali, the courtesan, is that correct?
I said court.
Court.
Yeah.
Is son.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like a port.
Yeah. So she had heard that the Buddha had arrived and that he was staying in her mango grove. So she owns a mango grove, which are also meant to be quite lovely places to stay. And and then she was really interested. So she really wanted to meet the Buddha. Then the story goes, she had the finest carriages harnessed. Yeah, so she's really doing herself up. Then she mounted a fine carriage and along with other fine carriages set out from Vesali for her own park. She went by carriage as far as the terrain allowed, then descended and approached the Buddha on foot. She bowed and sat down to one side. The Buddha educated, encouraged, fired up, and inspired her with the Dhamma talk. And then, because she was so inspired, she said to the Buddha, "Sir, may the Buddha together with the mendicant Sangha," so the monks, "please accept tomorrow's meal from me." Yeah, that was usual at the time that the monks and nuns, they would only accept food if it was offered to them. Yeah, so there was a tradition of offering, because they were all wanderers. Yeah, they were homeless wanderers. The Buddha consented with silence. Then, knowing that the Buddha had consented, Ambapali got up from her seat, bowed, and respectfully circled the Buddha, keeping him on her right before leaving. That's also traditional. But now she gets competition. The Lichavis of Vesali, so that's a group of people, also heard that the Buddha had arrived and was staying in Ambapali's mango grove. They had the finest carriages harnessed. Then they mounted a fine carriage and along with other fine carriages set out from Vesali. And those Lichavis, they're sort of young people, yeah, sort of young guys, I think. Some of the Lichavis were in blue, of blue color, clad in blue, adorned with blue. And some were similarly colored in yellow, of yellow color, clad in yellow, adorned with yellow. And some of them were red, of red color, clad in red, adorned with red. And some of them were wearing white, of white color, clad in white and adorned with white. So they were all sort of wearing the latest fashions of Vesali, really doing themselves up, really wearing the latest trends of Vesali fashion. A bit like Fashion Week here sometimes. So then Ambapali, the courtesan, collided with those literary youths on the way, axle to axle, wheel to wheel, yoke to yoke. So they bumped into each other. And the literaries said to her, and they're very rude, "What, you wench, Ambapali, are you doing colliding with us axle to axle, wheel to wheel, yoke to yoke?" "Well, masters, it's because I've invited the Buddha for tomorrow's meal, together with the mendicant Sangha." "Wench, give us that meal for 100,000. So they want to invite the Buddha as well. "Masters, even if you were to give me Vesali with her provinces, I still wouldn't give that meal to you." So she's insisting. Yeah, she really wants to offer, the Buddha the meal because, he's an enlightened person, and it gives you a lot of merit if you can offer food to people who practice the religious life. So then, the literaries, being really young and naive and arrogant, snapped their fingers saying, "We've been beaten by the auntie. sometimes in some translations it's the mango lass. They call her the mango. We've been beaten by the mango lass. And then they continued on to Ambapali's mango grove because they're still certain to see the Buddha. And now comes I just find this lovely. So the Buddha sees them coming in the distance, yeah? Remember, this is all these sort of young guys in like lovely dresses and, like perfumes maybe even, like blue and red and yellow, white. So he sees them coming in the distance. So he turns to his monks and says, any of the mendicants, any of the monks who've never seen the gods of the 33 before, so that's in Indian cosmology, these are like sort of high-ranking gods, beautiful deities, which you can, according to Buddhist tradition, you can see in meditation. So the deep meditative experiences, you can sort of start to see that form of beauty. It's a realm of beauty. So he says, any of the mendicants who've never seen the gods of the 33 before, just have a look at the assembly of the Lichavis. See the assembly of Lichavis, check them out. They are just like the 33. I find that so lovely. It's like, I don't know, it's sometimes again, he's 80 and you can sort of see I think he's joking. He's sort of like, I think he has this smirk on his face. That's how I imagine it. It's just sort of like, I don't know, sometimes I get that. I mean, I'm only 31, but I don't know, when you sort of see young guys or girls dressed up and sort of trying to, you just think, yeah, of course, that's what you do. It's just like when you're in that age. You sort of, I don't think we should sort of, he's not shaming them. He's not sort of telling them off for dressing up. But it's just lovely, isn't it? It's life. It's sort of youth trying to really express itself. And it's just life, isn't it? It's life and beauty. And beauty also being a, big quality in Buddhism. So anyway, they come and they try to convince the Buddha that they are much more suited. They're much more suited to meeting the Buddha than Ambapali, the courtesan. But obviously the Buddha says, well, I've already agreed to her. So they again snap their fingers and say, we've been beaten by the mango lass. We've been beaten by the auntie. And then they go away and meet the Buddha a different day. So he's sort of really teaching them, responsibility, and you can sort of see they're sort of full of arrogance and sort of youthful naivety and thinking they're sort of the latest shit or something. So that's the second story. And I just want to finish with the last story, which sort of contains the biggest teaching, I think. So he's in his last few, I guess, days or maybe even weeks, he's meeting all sorts of people. He does get sick. It's quite clear his body isn't up for handling the sickness anymore. He's just taking some rest. And then Ananda again comes to him. And there's all sorts of questions, and you can see that Ananda's really worked up. He's really worried that the Buddha is going to die soon. So the Buddha, being very sick, gives Ananda a last teaching. And he tells him, Ananda, you can always, whenever the Buddha talks to Ananda, he's sort of slightly telling him off a bit. Poor Ananda. So the Buddha says to Ananda, and that's the teaching, Ananda, abide self-reliant, taking refuge in yourself, not taking refuge in others. Reliant on the Dhamma, the teaching, taking refuge in the Dhamma, not taking refuge in another. So he's saying, abide self-reliant, taking refuge only in yourself, not taking refuge in others, and reliant on the Dhamma, taking refuge in the Dhamma, not taking refuge in another. And that is actually a teaching which is mirrored all throughout the Buddhist teachings. There's even a saying where the Buddha says something like, take refuge in yourself, be a lamp, be an island unto yourself. This is the only refuge. So that's interesting, isn't it? He's saying, on the one hand, what we must do is we ought to take refuge in ourselves, be self-reliant, not seeking refuge in others. And on the other hand, he's telling Ananda to take refuge in the teaching, in the Dhamma, the truth. So that might be a slightly contradiction, right? There might be a sort of contradiction there. Are we now to just follow ourselves and our own, urges and impulses, or are we to actually follow a teaching, a path, something that's set out before us? And again, Sangharakshita makes, in his talk about this, makes a very interesting point. He says that he thinks these are sort of the two poles of the spiritual life. Yeah, these are the two poles of the spiritual life. Is that on the one hand, spiritual life is about self-development, taking responsibility for ourselves, so this is what we're doing here. We're learning how to meditate, transforming our own mind, really working on our mind, becoming more mindful, opening up to metta, to loving kindness. We're trying to be more ethical, we're trying to be friendly, we're trying to sort of not just do it for ourselves, but, even with others outside, on the U-Bahn, I'm trying to be friendly, patient, generous, but really trying to becoming an individual, transforming our own consciousness through meditation, through ethics, less dependent on, what do others think of us, how can we please others, becoming much more self-dependent through friendship, ethics, and so on. And then he says sort of the other pole of the spiritual life is devotion to a supremely worthwhile object. So we can only develop ourselves if we have something that is worthwhile to devote ourselves to. Some sort of ideal, something that, some direction really. Otherwise we can just sort of develop as we please in all sorts of directions if you want to. So that's sort of the second teaching in there. It's a sort of spiritual life makes sense once we've found for us something that we can venerate, something that we can devote or commit ourselves to. Over the last few weeks, Padmasara and Tarpalta have explored that whole theme of commitment. That's what that means, is finding a worthwhile object, a supremely worthwhile object that we can devote ourselves to, some sort of higher ideal, something that we can practice. And for Buddhists, this is obviously the Dharma, the teaching of the Buddha, something that leads to enlightenment, to transcendence. And Sangharakshita in the talk is making a sort of statement of, devotion means both obviously having devotional feelings, sort of, cultivating that sense of looking up, revering, which is maybe something that in modern times isn't so obvious for us. It doesn't come easy. We sort of think, well, that's, it's a sort of medieval thing. I always had that. When I grew up, I was always a bit suspicious of religion anyway. I grew up without any religion. I grew up in East Berlin after the wall fell, but still in that environment. But nonetheless, maybe I'm just a weird child, but nonetheless, I just remember as a child already that started that sense of, well, wouldn't it be nice if I could go into a place of worship or like a church or a temple, and I would always light a candle not knowing what that is. So I think there seems to be a sort of human need almost for wanting to venerate something, wanting to revere something. It's just that in our experience, we've learned to be quite suspicious, and rightly so, with veneration, because we see where that leads. But we're also seeing now that a lack of that leads to not good things either. So for me, it was one of those almost revelations that I felt like, I can actually revere something, I can devote myself to something higher, and learn to grow from there. And the Buddha, in a different sutta, he is saying that not to revere anything means to suffer. He does say that. That's when he asks himself, well, now that he is the Buddha, who is he revering? He's really asking himself the question, because he thinks, well, not to revere anything is suffering. It's the Buddha. The Buddha says that about himself when he knows that he can't revere himself. So he then decides to venerate, to revere, to devote himself to the Dhamma, the truth, a sort of transcendental truth, which is non-personal, which is sort of that law of the fact that we can all get enlightened. So even the Buddha needs something to revere. Yeah, even he is not without veneration. So you can see it's not something where we try to put ourselves down or sort of make ourselves small. It is actually an opening up, a becoming bigger, in my experience. And the Buddha as well. That's what I want to finish with. When he is very sick, lies down and sees all these flowers, all the petals, these untimely flowers raining down on him, he is actually saying, this is very lovely. Thank you very much. But he's sort of saying, but this isn't actually the way to revere a Buddha. The best way to venerate and revere a Buddha is to practice the Dharma. Yeah, is to actually put yourself to the practice. And achieve that state of enlightenment yourself. That's the best way you can devote yourself to a Buddha. But again, I feel like it fits quite well into our modern sentiment of like, okay, yeah, so we're not supposed to actually feel anything. We're just supposed to do it. I do think we need both. Yeah, we need both that kind of commitment to spiritual development, personal development, taking responsibility for our own lives, for our own minds, and finding the truth that we can then live by. So I'm just going to finish with the last words that the Buddha ever said to his disciples. So this is before he died. He sort of called them together for one last teaching. And the only thing he then in the end says, he says quite a few things, but at the end he sort of says, all things that are subject to arising are bound to cease. With mindfulness, strive on. That's the last thing he says. Thank you very much.